This influencer mocked a Sherpa. She died after. YouTube https://www.youtube.com/watch v=ulvdct-yfwi. Transcript 00:00. In today's episode, we will uncover how publicly mocking a Sherpa on Mount Everest placed one influencer into a narrowing chain of decisions she could not escape. What began as ridicule for an audience became a refusal to listen. The mountain would resolve the outcome without negotiation. It was May 21st, 2016 on the south side of Mount Everest in Nepal. 0024. Climbers were moving through the upper section of the Khumbu icefall along the approach between Everest Base Camp at 17,598 feet and Camp 1 at approximately 19,900 feet. This stretch of the route lies on a constantly shifting glacier where towering snow bridges and deep creases are formed by the slow but continuous movement of ice. 0048. During the late pre-monsoon season, daytime temperatures typically range between -5 degrees Fahrenheit and 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Beneath the surface, internal ice remains far colder, preserving fractures and voids hidden below thin crusts of compacted snow. All Voss was 24 years old. She was a German national working as a travel and lifestyle influencer, with approximately 38,000 followers across Instagram and YouTube. Her outdoor experience included multi-day alpine trees in Europe, guided ascents on peaks below 19,685 feet, and extensive solo travel documentation. She had no prior experience with 26,246-foot mountains and no intention of attempting Everest summit. Ara joined a mid-tier commercial expedition primarily to observe and experience Everest's lower routes, with the intent of shaping those experiences into public-facing narratives rather than pursuing high-altitude performance. Planning began roughly 8 months earlier, centered on logistics, access, and how the experience would be publicly framed, rather than on high-altitude performance. Teammates later described her as physically capable, confident on snow and ice, and intensely focused on presenting her experience in a dramatic, attention-driven way. The Khumbu icefall is crossed using a fixed-line system installed and maintained by specialized Sherpa teams known as the Icefall Doctors. Aluminum ladders, typically 18 to 22 feet long, are lashed together to span creases that can exceed 150 feet in depth. Snow bridges form unpredictably over open voids, sometimes only a few feet thick, and may appear solid while concealing collapse zones beneath wind-packed snow. Movement through the icefall is intentionally slow. Climbers remain clipped to ropes at all times. Spacing is enforced and pauses for inspection are routine. Each step is taken with the understanding that the surface can fail without warning. In the days leading up to May 21st, conditions in the icefall were described by expedition leaders as relatively stable for the season. 0303. Overnight temperatures remained low enough to slow ice movement, and no major serac collapses had been reported in the previous 48 hours. Satellite forecasts showed a brief window of calm weather, prompting several teams, including Ara's, to schedule rotation climbs to Camp 1. At the same time, subtle warning signs were present. 0324. Sherpa route teams reported faint cracking sounds beneath certain snow bridges during early morning crossings. Hairline fractures had been flagged and re-evaluated the previous afternoon. Standard protocol required reassessment of ladder anchors and load limits before each group passage. None of these indicators suggested imminent collapse, but they reinforced the long-standing reality of the icefall. 0346. The route was considered passable, not safe. Ara's climbing setup reflected standard commercial expedition gear. She wore a helmet, crampons, and boots rated for extreme cold. Her harness was pitted with dual locking carabiners for fixed-line travel. She carried an ice axe and collapsible trekking poles for balance across ladder sections. The group departed base camp shortly after 3:30 am, following standard icefall protocol designed to minimize exposure during warmer daylight hours. 8 climbers moved together, guided by 3 Sherpa, including lead Sherpa Pembe Atashi. Headlamps illuminated a narrow corridor of fixed rope threading through broken ice towers and ladder crossings already familiar from previous rotations. Ara adopted a performative tone almost immediately, speaking casually and projecting confidence as the group entered the icefall. Her early behavior reflected controlled breathing, steady footing, and casual commentary delivered with an outward performative confidence. She joked about the early hour and openly referred to the icefall briefing as unnecessary repetition. As the group moved higher, the terrain became denser with ladder systems angled across widening creases. Each climber clipped and unclipped in sequence, waiting for verbal confirmation before advancing. Progress was methodical and slow. The group paused at marked inspection points where Sherpa checked ladder lashings and ice anchors. Ara remained within the group formation, but her attention repeatedly shifted away from the route and toward the Sherpa team during these stops. No one objected at this stage. The climb proceeded as planned. 7 climbers and 3 Sherpa witnessed Ara's behavior during the ascent that morning. Multiple climbers later described her tone as dismissive and performative, particularly when Sherpa teams paused to inspect route features. One climber reported that she repeatedly directed her attention toward the Sherpa while rolling her eyes during safety checks. Another recalled feeling uncomfortable as her commentary became louder and less subtle. Sherpa team members confirmed that standard warnings were given calmly and professionally. Pembeatashi, the lead Sherpa, was observed explaining route conditions in clear, deliberate language. Several climbers stated that interrupted him at least once, speaking over his instructions while continuing her commentary. No witnesses reported reckless behavior from the Sherpa team or unnecessary delays. The group dynamic remained orderly, but tension was noticeable. By this point, her mockery was no longer private or incidental. It was public, audible, and witnessed. Witness accounts place Elara's behavior becoming more pronounced approximately 27 minutes after departure from base camp. At that point, her movement remained controlled, her breathing steady, and there was no outward sign of physical strain. Fixed ropes, ladder sections, and headlamp-lit ice corridors surrounded the group as they paused for inspection. At the first safety stop, attention focused on a ladder spanning a crease approximately 20 feet wide. Sherpa voices discussed anchor placement and load sequencing while the group waited. During this pause, Ara openly mocked the inspection process, referring to it as unnecessary and mimicking the cadence of the Sherpa's English while laughing. The latter remained unused throughout the exchange. No one advanced. At a second stop, witnesses observed Pembeatashi standing several feet ahead, gesturing toward a snow-covered section adjacent to the fixed line. His posture remained neutral, his movements slow and instructional as he explained the condition of the route. Ara responded by repeating his words in an exaggerated accent, openly mocking his delivery. Laughter followed. Another climber briefly turned toward the interaction, then looked away. The Sherpa team continued their work without reaction. Ara continued her commentary aloud, questioning why anyone would be afraid of what she described as solid ice. Those nearby later recalled faint cracking sounds beneath footfalls during this pause, consistent with surface settling. As the group waited, Ara stepped closer to the edge of the fixed route. The carabiner remained clipped at this point. Pembe again advised patience and spacing, repeating standard warnings in a calm, measured tone. Ara responded openly, mocking the warning and referring to the process as safety theater. Her laughter continued uninterrupted. There was no argument, no raised voices from the Sherpa, and no visible agitation. The warnings were repeated calmly. Witness accounts later placed these exchanges less than 10 minutes before the collapse. Despite the tension created by her commentary, Ara continued moving within the group structure. Other climbers maintained standard spacing and communication, choosing not to confront her directly. Several later explained that confrontation inside the icefall is discouraged unless safety is immediately compromised. 8:50. The priority remains controlled movement and minimizing exposure time. Ara interacted casually with teammates during brief pauses, encouraging others to engage with her commentary and joking about how seriously the Sherpa teams treated each obstacle. Some climbers responded with short, non-committal replies, others avoided engagement altogether. 9:11. No one joined her mockery. The Sherpa team continued performing inspections without visible reaction, maintaining the same procedural pace and neutral demeanor. Pembeatashi was observed maintaining consistent professionalism. He repeated instructions as needed, pointed out hazards, and ensured each climber remained clipped to the rope. 9:32. His communication style did not change in response to Ara's behavior. There were no raised voices, no reprimands, and no escalation from the Sherpa side. This normally is important. The group was not in chaos, the route was not rushed. the Sherpa team was not distracted. From an operational standpoint, the climb remained orderly. Ara's behavior stood out precisely because everything else remained controlled. Her mockery existed alongside competence, not in response to incompetence. By this stage, the contrast between her attitude and the environment around her was clear to everyone present. As the group progressed higher into the icefall, the terrain narrowed into a section known for concealed snow bridges. This area required especially strict adherence to fixed lines, as the visual surface often concealed voids beneath thin layers of wind-packed snow. Sherpa team slowed the group further, spacing climbers to reduce load on suspect areas. Weather conditions remained within acceptable limits. Winds were light and visibility was clear. There was no external pressure from deteriorating forecasts. The urgency was routine, not reactive. The goal was to reach Camp Wine efficiently, not quickly. At one inspection point, Sherpa identified a section of ice adjacent to the fixed line that appeared solid but had not been load tested. The route was deliberately placed several feet away to distribute weight across reinforced anchors. Pemby explained the reasoning and instructed climbers to remain clipped and centered. This was a standard protocol moment. Nothing about it was unusual. No one objected, except her commentary resumed louder than before as the delay stretched past several minutes. She gestured toward the inspected area, presenting it as obviously safe. She questioned why experienced mountaineers would wait when the ice appeared stable. This framing mattered. It established a narrative of exaggerated caution versus personal confidence. By positioning herself as the counterexample, she set up a decision point. The Sherpa warning was clear. The boundary was defined. What followed was not confusion, it was a choice. At approximately 6:12 a.m., Ara stopped just behind the inspection point. She paused deliberately, steadying herself and smiling as if unbothered by the delay. Her breathing remained even. There was no visible distress. She clipped and unclipped slowly, lingering longer than necessary. The fixed rope ran directly beside her, while Sherpa voices continued ahead, engaged in routine checks. Ara turned her body slightly toward the open ice beside the roof, positioning herself away from the reinforced line. Witness accounts later identified this moment as the final pause before she stepped away from the rope. The section of the icefall directly ahead was not a narrow passage, but a deceptive open span where the glacier surface appeared continuous. In reality, it was a lattice of overlapping snow bridges layered over a deep crease system formed by differential ice flow. Ground-penetrating probes used earlier in the season had mapped voids beneath this area, ranging from 30 to over 100 feet deep. The fixed route had been deliberately placed along a reinforced line of compression, where ice blocks pressed together, increasing load tolerance. The snow surface adjacent to the route was smoother, untracked, and visually uniform. Wind had scoured away surface irregularities, leaving a hard crust that concealed the underlying void. This kind of surface is especially dangerous because it provides no visual warning, no sagging, no visible fracture lines, no audible collapse until failure occurs. The fixed rope ran approximately 4 feet to the left of this area, anchored into ice screws driven at downward angles to resist vertical pull. The load calculations assumed one climber at a time, clipped, moving steadily. Any lateral movement away from the rope shifted weight onto untested snow. As Ara stood at the edge of the inspected zone, the contrast between the reinforced route and the open ice was visually apparent. To her left, the fixed line and ladder system. To her right, what appeared to be solid ground. The icefall doctors had marked the untested section earlier with a shallow boot trench indicating avoidance, but wind had partially erased it overnight. The icefall was quiet. There was no wind gust, no icefall sound, no visible movement. This silence is typical in the early morning hours when internal glacier movement slows but does not stop. The danger is static, not dynamic. Failure comes from load, not noise. Ar's position placed her directly above a concealed snow bridge, estimated later to be less than 3 feet thick at its strongest point. Beneath it was a vertical shaft narrowing irregularly, with ice walls polished smooth by previous collapses. The geometry of the crest meant that a fall would not be clean. A falling body would strike the walls repeatedly before becoming lodged or continuing deeper. None of this was visible from the surface. The only indication was the Sherpa's instruction to stay clipped and centered. The first warning sign is audible. A dull, compressed sound carries upward from beneath the snow surface as weight shifts nearby. It is not a sharp crack, but a muted, settling noise, the kind produced when a thin snow bridge compresses rather than fractures. Several climbers pause instinctively, tightening their grip on the fixed line. The Sherpa further ahead stops moving altogether. Those nearby heard the sound faintly. It was followed by a subtle vibration beneath foot as fine snow dust trickled downward along a shallow seam in the ice. Pembatashi reacted immediately, raising his arm and calling for everyone to hold position. His voice is firm but controlled. He points directly at the area beside the fixed rope, indicating a soft zone that has not been load-tested. Ara turned toward him instead of the ground. She laughed and repeated his warning in an exaggerated tone, dismissing the sound as normal ice noise. She remains clipped at this moment, but her body language shifts. She steps laterally closer to the edge of the reinforced route, positioning herself away from the fixed line. The snow beneath her boots appears smooth and unbroken. A second warning follows seconds later. A visible hairline depression forms where the surface compresses slightly under shifting load nearby. It is subtle, no more than an inch, but unmistakable to trained eyes. Pembia gestures again, this time stepping forward and pointing directly at the fixed rope, reinforcing the instruction to stay centered and clipped. Ara responds verbally, her tone impatient. She frames the moment as proof of unnecessary fear. She gestures toward the ice as she explains that confidence matters more than caution. She unclips deliberately. The metallic sound was heard by those closest to her. Pemba immediately called out, instructing her to return to the rope. She does not. Instead, she steps forward onto the untested snow bridge, still smiling, still speaking, and visibly unconcerned. The warnings have been issued, they are clear, they are witnessed. The environment has signaled instability twice. What remains is only the consequence of ignoring it. At approximately 6:14 a.m., the snow bridge fails. The collapse is not explosive. It begins with a downward shear as the thin upper crust fractures along an irregular stress line. The surface drops several inches before giving way completely. Ara's left foot breaks through first, followed immediately by the right as the remaining snow plate disintegrates under her full body weight. Witnesses described a sudden vertical drop as gravity took over. Ara fell feet first into the crease. Her body rotated almost immediately, driven by uneven contact with the collapsing snow edge. She struck the right ice wall within the first second of the fall. The impact produced a dull, resonant sound, consistent with helmet contact against hard glacial ice. The fall continued. Her body rotated again, this time shoulder first, striking the opposite wall. Those above heard a single sharp scream, cut short by another impact. Snow and ice fragments fell after her, echoing through the crease. Based on later measurements, the initial freefall distance is estimated at approximately 40 feet. Below that point, the crease narrows unevenly. Ara's body became wedged between opposing ice faces, halting further descent, but subjecting her to additional blunt force trauma as momentum dissipated. One trekking pole separated during the fall and was later found embedded in the ice wall roughly 15 feet below the collapse point. After the final impact, there was no visible movement from Ara, no attempts to reposition, no vocal response. Within seconds, Pembachi reached the edge of the collapse zone but stopped short, remaining clipped to the fixed line. He called Ara's name repeatedly, his tone shifting from instructional to urgent. He instructed other climbers to stay back and radioed for technical rescue support. Other climbers peered down from safe positions. Headlamp beams illuminated a partial view of her body wedged at an unnatural angle between the ice walls. She was motionless. The helmet showed visible cracking along the side. One arm hung downward, unresponsive. Pembi continued calling to her while assessing anchor points for a potential rescue descent. His breathing remained controlled but strained as he coordinated with others above and below. Ice continued settling around the collapse zone as communication continued. 1924. At that moment, it was not yet known to those above whether survival was possible. Immediate rescue was not possible. The collapse destabilized the surrounding surface and additional snow continued to slough into the crease for several minutes. Standard protocol required all climbers to remain stationary until the icefall doctors confirmed that anchor points could safely support a rescue load. 1946. Pembiati remained at the edge of the collapse zone, clipped to the fixed line, maintaining verbal contact despite receiving no response. A technical rescue team was dispatched from lower in the icefall. The estimated response time was extended due to the need to reroute around unstable sections and re-anchor ladders disturbed by the collapse. 4 hours passed before a controlled descent into the crease could be attempted. During this time, environmental conditions deteriorated slightly as solar radiation increased surface instability. When Sherpa rescuers finally descended, they found body wedged between converging ice walls at an approximate depth of 60 feet. The position of her body indicated a vertical fall followed by rotational impacts. There were no signs of purposeful movement. Extraction required controlled ice cutting and load redistribution to prevent secondary collapse. Her body was recovered intact, but with extensive trauma. Visible injuries included severe cranial fractures consistent with helmet failure upon impact, multiple broken ribs, and spinal compression injuries. Internal bleeding was later confirmed through post-mortem examination. Medical assessment concluded that death occurred within minutes of the fall, primarily due to catastrophic head trauma compounded by internal injuries. There was no evidence of equipment malfunction. Her harness remained intact. 2114. The fixed line she detached from was undamaged. Witness statements and expedition reports corroborated one another. Multiple climbers independently described her mocking commentary. Pembi's repeated warnings and his urgent calls immediately after the collapse. Physical evidence recovered from the site aligned with these accounts. 2134. The expedition halted for the remainder of the day. Climbers descended in silence. Several later described feeling physically ill, replaying the event in their minds. No one disputed what had happened or why. The cause was documented clearly in expedition reports: deliberate detachment from the fixed line and entry onto an untested snow bridge despite direct warnings. 2156. All's body was flown by helicopter from base camp. After recovery logistics were completed, her family requested privacy and did not contest the findings. Within days, all social media content mocking Sherpa culture and safety practices was removed by her management team. Scheduled posts were cancelled. Comment sections were disabled. In the years that followed, the incident was referenced quietly among guides and expedition leaders as a preventable outcome tied to behavior rather than conditions. It was discussed during internal briefings and informal training conversations, not as a freak occurrence, but as an example of how protocol failures emerge from deliberate human choice rather than environmental surprise. Cultural briefings within commercial expeditions were expanded, emphasizing Sherpa authority, communication hierarchy, and the non-negotiable nature of route protocol inside the icefall. These discussions were typically brief, factual, and stripped of narrative framing and focused on compliance. During route maintenance nearly a decade later, Sherpa teams recovered personal effects from within the crevasse after glacier movement exposed buried debris. The recovered items supported the original timeline and reinforced conclusions that had already been understood on the mountain. The Khumbu icefall did not change after May 21, 2016. Fixed lines were still clipped, ladders still crossed, and delays still enforced. What changed was how behavior inside the icefall was addressed. Commercial teams formalized expectations around compliance, explicitly stating that Sherpa route decisions were binding safety directives rather than suggestions, commentary material, or content opportunities. These instructions were no longer implied through custom or experience. They were stated clearly, repeatedly, and without exception during briefings, rotations, and route crossings. For those who witnessed it, the lesson was not abstract. The icefall did not react to intention, personality, or belief. It responded only to physical reality. Authority in that environment was not cultural or hierarchical. It was functional, built on experience, repetition, and survival. Ignoring it carried no warning beyond the one already given. Within expedition circles, the incident became a reference point not for environmental danger, but for decision-making under authority. Guides emphasized that the icefall does not reward confidence, creativity, or individual interpretation. It responds only to load, timing, and compliance. In briefings that followed, climbers were reminded that hesitation is survivable, delay is manageable, but defiance inside the icefall is not. Eros did not survive the fall. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more.